Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. So this is going to be the last video of 2024 and it is going to be another sketchbook session. I kind of wanted to revisit this idea again of doing another comic or like mini comic kind of thing in my sketchbook. So if you haven't, you can watch that video right here. But today I wanted to revisit a few sketches that I did at the beginning of the month where I briefly planned out another scenario for a comic, but it's going to require a few more pages. So I ended up doing actual like more proper thumbnailing on sticky notes so we can kind of figure out our paneling. So right here, I ended up doing the sketches off screen so that I could take my time to actually flesh everything out to the point where I wanted to kind of look like. So we ended up having 6 pages. But before we jump into that, let me go ahead and show you a bit of a close-up at our little thumbnails. So like I mentioned, these are kind of like the little planning ones that I did earlier. So I did these around December 6th and I kind of like wrote a little bit of dialogue and then I did a little bit of thumbnailing. After that, I went to go ahead and pull out some sticky notes and started to actually plan things out a little bit more fleshed out. So I had a better idea of how I wanted to sketch everything out on their individual pages. So like I mentioned, we are going to be doing 6 pages today, so it's going to be a lot of inking. So while I'm showing you guys kind of the close-ups of our pages today, if the page seems significantly more darker and a little bit more purpley gray, it's because I have sticker paper, like matte sticker paper in my sketchbook to kind of prevent bleed through, because we are going to be adding 1, a little bit of ink, but 2, we are going to be using alcohol markers to help do our midtones and adding some gray to give more, I guess like form and dimension to some of our panels here. So for the sketch, I ended up using the same blue, I believe, as before. So it's just a normal blue. It's not like the photo blue that some people use for their sketches. And this one's the Uni Dia Colour, according to what I can read on the screen. And I like using it. It's kind of like softer and easier on the eyes. As for inking, I did pull out my calligraphy pens right here. You can see that it comes in extra fine. I also have one that comes in fine, and then we have medium and a brush pen. So I'm going to use these to help color in or fill in my black areas. And then for our main line arting tool, I am going to be using the Ohuhu fine liners. So I'm going to use, I think, the same ones I used previously, which is the 02 and the 0.5. So these ones I find a little bit easier for me to use to kind of like interchangeably use between like having more detail or something that has a little bit more of a thickness. So I believe in the previous video where I did like the little mini comic pages in my sketchbook, I've asked you guys whether or not you guys do the bubbles and your panel borders before you do like the inking of the inside, like the contents of it. And there's kind of like a mixed response. I know some people did mention that they prefer inking everything and then doing your borders after so that you don't accidentally, I guess like make things contained so that you allow your character, your text to kind of break the frame of your panels. So in this case, I am going to be following the same procedure that I did before. So I'm doing the text first, and then I will do the borders next. I just find it a little bit easier for myself to keep my inking a little bit more clean. I believe I've seen other people also just like draw over their borders and all that, because I guess when you scan them or if you plan to like use them for something else, you can always like edit them out and make them cleaner in post. But for me, to keep kind of like my inking more contained, it's easier for me to have like a border already set out for myself. Now, I do run into some issues where I accidentally have the lines overlap, either accidentally closing a bubble fully without having the little tail, or I accidentally add the border right over a gutter, which is the space in between each of the panels. So I'm going to show you guys in a little bit how I kind of remedy that, because I do have several areas that I kind of need to fix. Oh, I guess I ended up doing it right here. So Artex actually has these nice paint pens that are quite opaque. So I just did 2 layers of the paint pen. You can kind of see it very kind of like subtly, but for the most part on camera, I don't think it's going to show up too badly. In person, it's a little bit more in your face, but if you want to use something to kind of help cover up your mistakes from your inking, I definitely recommend if you have acrylic paint markers, you can use that. If you have acrylic paint and a small brush, you could also use that. Obviously, if you have office supplies or you're a pen user, you might have some sort of whiteout. So that could also be a way for you to kind of fix up mistakes if you really need to. But after we finish up doing our panels, our borders, and our text, I am going to go and start to do majority of the inking. So for our like finer lines and the majority of our like outlines and the sketch of the characters and stuff, I am going to be mostly using the Ohuhu fine liners. I'm using 0.5 a little bit more often than the 0.2. I thought I was going to use the 0.2 because I wanted to add more detail in certain areas, but I found the 0.5 was kind of more suitable with considering how large certain objects were. It was just easier for me to fill in the space with hatching and all that. So kind of in our first frame or panel, I wanted to have like a more of like a background. Now I haven't inked a background in a super long time, so it's going to be very vague and kind of rusty looking, but hopefully in the future, maybe I will do some more, not landscapes per se, I guess like more like cityscape, street view kind of esque photography that I can find reference for, and then do some inking of that. Because a long time ago, back in like uni, I would actually do, I guess like almost like photo studies, but all I had was a fine liner, which I used to take my notes, and I would bring it to one of my sociology classes. And in the class, while I'm waiting for the prof to come in, I just doodle and start to like really hatch and build up that entire scene. I don't think I have the sketch anymore, but if I do find it, I'll make sure to put in the video right here. But I'm pretty sure I've misplaced that entire notebook, probably because it only contained notes and it wasn't really for like sketches per se. But let me explain a little bit of our scenario, since you guys are going to get a little bit more of like snippets of the text. I did try my best to limit the amount I was going to show you guys while I was inking the text bubbles until we started to do the full-on inking, which is going to be mostly entirely in time-lapse now, because I want to show the entire progress of how I slowly build up certain areas. And I do apologize that my webcam does do a weird thing that sometimes when my hand is not in frame, it doesn't recognize, I guess, like the color or something like that, so it makes everything more contrasted. But once my hand enters the frame again, it kind of makes the white balance or whatever it's causing it to be off, so everything turns lighter again. So it might have like subtle back and forth, not exactly like flashing, but something a little bit similar. So I do apologize that the lighting is not super consistent in some of the shots that I have. So to kind of like start off with our frames, I had more of like I don't know if it's an establishing shot, but I wanted Kaisen to be entering into the flower shop or the little flower boutique that Masaki works at, and it's raining outside and he's just coming in kind of like dusting off the little droplets or whatever on his clothing because it started to really pour as soon as he entered into the flower shop. So if you're reading along with the text, basically after Kaisen enters into the flower shop, just because he's like checking up on Masaki because he's probably just like passing by or something, but he sees that the lights are still on, so he's like, why aren't you closing up? So he comes in to check on him. Actually, maybe I should have talked about this first because I don't remember the last time I talked about this. Koji's grandparents are actually the owners of the flower shop. I do have like a story up until the point that Masaki meets Koji in the story already like written out on like an old iPod, like in the notes app. So if I can revive that, maybe I'll actually like make the intro for it. But Masaki meets like Koji's grandparents by coincidence and then ends up working part-time for the grandparents while he's like attending university. So because of that, Koji often comes and hangs out with Masaki at the flower shop. So I thought it'd be cute that maybe it was sunnier that day and Koji visited Masaki when it had more of like warmer temperatures and it wasn't raining. So he doesn't have his usual hoodie or his vest with him. So as he's preparing to leave, they realize that it's raining too hard and Masaki doesn't want Koji to get sick. So they're trying to find a way for him to have a way to get home like safe and dry without getting sick, but he doesn't have an umbrella. So right now, with the frame that I'm currently working on, they are hiding under what I wanted it to be was Masaki's apron, so that they were going to just run and bolt to Koji's house, drop him off, and then Masaki would come back to the shop and like lock up for the night. But that's when Kaisen comes in, because of course he has bad timing. So he stumbles upon both of them kind of testing out whether or not the apron will work to have enough coverage for the rain, but I would expect that it wouldn't be as like the coverage is not as good. So who has a big piece of clothing that they could probably use? Kaisen does. So if you're unfamiliar with my OC Kaisen, he kind of has a modern, I was gonna say it's kind of like a kimono. If I remember correctly, when I was looking up references for his attire, I was looking at a lot of like Japanese streetwear, and one thing that I saw was more of like a casual style kimono jacket, but it kind of looks more like a longer version of a cardigan. So I kind of go back and forth of how I refer it to, or how I refer to it. So his cardigan, in the sense, it's like very flowy and has like very large sleeves, so it has a lot of real estate for people to be under it. So I decided that, you know, Kaisen's now article of clothing is going to be the protective shield from our other two boys from the rain, which happens to be our next panel. So hopefully the comic sequence kind of makes sense. I know, because obviously, I am not a writer. I think that's very evident, but I also don't think I planned the panels to have enough kind of like spacing, or like I guess like the pacing in between each of them might be a little bit too rushed. And it's mostly because I'm condensing things for time, as well as like, you know, my hand from doing all the manually inking and all that stuff I'm not used to. So this entirety of like, I think inking of just the 6 pages took me 3 hours, which is super long. But I wanted to do at least like a decent enough job about it. I don't think I really talked about this either, but the reason why I typically have been drawing kind of Kaisen more in terms of whenever I'm doing these comic videos, or if I do more like inking in general, I tend to draw Kaisen. It's just more because he has a lot of darker colors, or like black, so it's easier for me to kind of fiddle around with either wanting to do different types of hatching. Do I want to do more of like blockier cell shading to kind of like determine kind of like either the texture or the appearance of like a black object in this case. So for his hair, sometimes I add a little bit of hatching, sometimes I fully fill it in so that there's less line details, if that makes sense. And then oftentimes when I'm doing his clothes, I rely a lot on the little, I guess like where the light would hit for highlights for the clothing to kind of determine the form of it. Even though it would be nice to do maybe some more practice doing hatching in general so that I can apply it to other tones. So let's say for like Masaki or even for like Koji, I'll be able to apply more of the hatching to kind of get our gray tone rather than just doing kind of like flat blacks. Do a little bit of hatching to help transition it. It'll be just nice to have a little bit of variation here and there. Because like right now, looking at where I have my, I guess like majority of my black inks on the paper, there are tons of areas that have basically no value. There's a little bit of like line width variation, and sometimes like if there's an area that's dark enough, I'll fill it in as a flat black. But for the most part, I don't do too much hatching or shading when it comes to like mid-tone areas. So you can probably see it in sometimes like Masaki's clothing and stuff. It's mostly me going to be relying on using alcohol markers to fill in those values. But at this point, I'm just going to keep on experimenting a little bit more traditionally. I know digitally, I'm going to have a little bit more wiggle room. And technically, I do have the ability to do it traditionally as well if I would wish to do stuff with screen toning instead and manually cut out the frames and all that. So if I can and I find a sale for like more screen tones, maybe I'll purchase some to do more experimenting. But for now, I guess like the cheaper way and more of using the tools at my own disposal, playing around with like screen toning and different ways to kind of play around with the values is probably going to be a lot easier if I do it digitally. And I'm finding myself, at least when I'm working and doing the inking in my sketchbook, there is more of like a style that I lean towards, which is like more typical. So I don't think I'm going to experiment too much with how I'm going to draw them versus like how I want to portray, let's say, values or the backgrounds, or if I want to do like little mini derpy versions for like smaller things, then there might be a little bit more room for experimenting. But for now, I think I'm just going to focus on how I want to fill the objects and portray like texture and value, because at least like how I naturally like to ink, I think it's going to be like similar throughout every comic I'm going to be doing. So I'm not going to fiddle around with it too much. So we are working on the last page of our little comic. Like I said, there's going to be 6 pages. So once we finish off this particular last little panel, which was after the end question mark one, I will be switching over and using the alcohol markers to help fill in a lot of my grays, which sometimes I find a little bit hit or miss, because I think this might be the reason why I want to play around with like hatching and trying to fill in the values with some kind of inking technique instead. And you can do like cross hatching, hatching. There's like a bunch of different ways you can fill it with like different kind of line patterns, or if you want to do like stippling or whatever. Something about the gray just becomes a little bit too flat for my taste, even though there are some areas that I do like. The gray helps kind of like contribute more to the page. I'm not even sure if that made any sense, but here's kind of like an overview. So there's a lot of areas where Masaki and Koji are present where there is no values. So I'm going to go ahead and look at my little color swatches for the Ohuhu markers, pick out some neutral grays. So I think I picked neutral gray number 3 as like my lightest tone. Neutral gray number 5, I think, was kind of like my mid-tone, or it's number 3. But then after that, we use number 7 as well, I believe. I think I do show it to the screen at some point, so you can see what numbers that I used for our little setup here. So CGO blank number tend to be the neutral grays, but the NG as well was also a neutral gray, and I found it a little bit darker than the CG 050 counterpart. So I ended up using those 3 instead. I think in the previous little mini comic that I did in the other video, I picked an even lighter value, and I found that one a little bit unnecessary. So I think 3 is kind of like the maximum that I would use. And technically I could have gotten away with probably only 2 if I was able to incorporate a little bit more black into our page. Now, I totally forgot. I should have erased all of the blue marks in my sketch prior to adding any of the alcohol markers. You're probably going to see it because I'm going to zoom in when we start working back onto like the bell page, because I kind of accidentally locked in some of the blue pigment underneath the alcohol markers because I did not erase it prior. So make sure to erase your sketches before you're adding your values if you're not using like graphite for your flats or anything like that, or your gray areas. So I briefly mentioned this earlier, but if you're wondering how I am adding alcohol markers to my pages and not having bleed through, and even though I'm using like a very thin notebook paper for this particular sketchbook, I'm still able to use the alcohol markers comfortably because I'm using a matte sticker paper that I gotten off of Amazon, I think earlier this year, to kind of like play around with how I wanted to cover up like marker bleed through, or how to comfortably use alcohol markers in my sketchbook without having to worry with the bleed through. So for me, kind of how I went about choosing the sticker paper. One, obviously I'm going to look for the price, because if we're going to use this kind of frequently, I don't want to pick something that's super inaccessible or expensive. The second thing I wanted to look for is something that was going to hold up the ink. So matte sticker paper is probably like a very common term to look for, but I don't want one that's like specifically made for, let's say, laser printers. Only because I would be worried whether or not the ink would actually adhere to the paper properly, or if there's like a special coating that is needed or anything like that. So I felt more comfortable using a printer paper that was more suitable for inkjet printers, because, you know, we're using alcohol inks, not like a adhesion via heat, which is what the laser printers would use. And the thing I like about sticker paper is that they tend to have the sticky coating or some kind of coating on the back of your paper. So oftentimes, even if you think you're using a lot of ink, it won't seep through to the kind of like that plasticky backing that you stick onto your paper. So oftentimes when I'm using alcohol markers, I don't really see any ghosting per se. There might be a little bit that you can see, but it's due to the light going through the paper rather than the ink. So for the most part, it makes it a lot easier for me to use alcohol markers in my sketchbook if I wish to kind of like continue a spread, or if I want to cover up bleed through from a previous session, I can do that and draw on top even without using like any inks or alcohol markers. So the page that I'm currently working on, that's on the left hand side with the 3 under Kaisen's little shirt cardigan thing, is the one that has kind of like the sticker paper, and you can kind of see how the alcohol markers kind of lay on top of our paper here. So it's a little bit streaky in some areas, and you can do a little bit of like build up, but for the most part it lays down pretty flat. And for the most part, when I compare it to the kind of notebook paper that I have in this particular sketchbook, quote unquote, it's very similar. I think my notebook paper does have a little bit more of those like white specks that you get, and then my sticker paper kind of fills in those gaps a little bit more. But for the most part, if you look at the overall spread, they look quite similar. Obviously, if you have a sketchbook or a notebook that has more of a cream color or a warmer tone off-white, the sticker paper tends to be more of like a bright white or a very cool white. I know mine leans almost like more blue looking compared to the actual sketchbook notebook paper that I have. So if that's something that bothers you, then I would probably maybe look for some other alternative if you can. I did a whole video about like how you can kind of cover up bleed through if you use alcohol markers on one side and you get like a lot of bleed through on the other side of your paper. And oftentimes if I don't end up doing like the sticker paper method, I often fill up the bleed through side with either like sticky notes or spare scrap pieces of paper that I've doodled on, or doing like a full illustration on cardstock and sticking that in my sketchbook. You could probably do the same thing with doing something on printer paper, sticking that into your sketchbook to cover up bleed through. Because for me, even though I'm covering up certain pages with like sticker paper, sticky notes, miscellaneous papers, and like basically pasting it into my sketchbook, I consider that page already used, which is kind of nice. I know some people might want to like doodle underneath and then paste stuff on top to kind of like actually use the sketchbook, but for me, as long as something's on that page, I'm usually a-okay with just leaving it and moving on. I am the type of person who will try my best to use every single page in my books just because I want to use up the majority of the real estate so I can kind of get the most out of them. But if you're the type of person who just wants to use it comfortably, you don't have to feel the need to really fill your sketchbook. Just use it up as much as you can, I guess. But we are at the end. So I ended up adding all of our flat grays to every single page, and hopefully, I guess like this view, you can kind of see like the overview of all the pages together, do a quick little read of everything, as well as hopefully you can't see any of my sketchy lines that clearly on the webcam. But hopefully you guys enjoyed today's little session, and I'm gonna compare it to my previous session. I do think the way I drew Kaisen was a little bit more cute and prettier in my previous version. There is one frame in here that looks a little bit derpy on this page on the right, so I don't really like his face there, but that's okay. It'd be more for me to play around with to try and get something a little bit more consistent in the future. But hopefully you guys enjoyed today's little inking session of me doing another mini comic, and I'll be sure to make more in the upcoming new year. So I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!